And I think that's the one piece of evidence that you cannot find a reason why an innocent Erin would have done that.
The mushroom murders made headlines around the world. It all began on July 29, 2023, when Erin Patterson hosted a lunch at her home in regional Victoria. She had 4 guests that day: the parents of her estranged husband, Don and Gail Patterson, and Gail's sister, Heather Wilkinson, and her husband, Ian. Erin's ex-husband, Simon Patterson, had also been invited but cancelled the night before. That day, Erin cooked and served individual beef Wellingtons. Now, prosecutors argued all of them, except the one she ate herself, contained toxic death cap mushrooms. Within 12 hours, her guests fell violently ill. They were rushed to hospital, and days later, 3 of them were dead. Ian Wilkinson managed to survive, but only just. On November 2, 2023, Erin was arrested and charged with 3 counts of murder and 1 of attempted murder. Her trial began in April 2025, and after 10 long weeks, she was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 33 years. Erin is now appealing that conviction. Now, personally, I was interested in Erin's trial, but I wasn't following it very closely at the time. I wasn't aware of the individual pieces of evidence that convinced the jury to convict the mum of 2. But that all changed when I read a new book by Greg Hadrick called The Mushroom Murders. It is written from the perspective of a juror, and every detail in the book comes directly from the evidence the real jurors heard and saw during the trial. There was some material in this book that genuinely shocked me, and Greg joins me now to talk about some of those standout moments.
From the newsroom at news.com.au.
Well, Greg, thank you so much for chatting to news.com.au.
A pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
I want to start by talking about the reason Erin Patterson organised this lunch in the first place. It wasn't just a friendly catch-up. Erin said there was something pretty serious she wanted to discuss with her in-laws, right?
Yeah, that's true. And it had evolved over several text messages she had with Gail in particular. Over the 4 or 5 weeks previously, where she said she had a lump on her elbow and then she was going to go for an MRI, and Gail asked, very concerned how the MRI went, and she was saying, it's a bit troubling and maybe we should talk face to face about it. And then after the lunch, according to Ian Wilkinson, who was there, and Don, who spoke to Simon about it afterwards, she said to all 4 of her guests that she'd been diagnosed with cancer, and that it was quite serious. She needed to go in for treatment, and she could be in hospital for a week or 2. And part of the reason was to how she should break that news to her kids. Unfortunately for her, for Erin, what the police were able to prove through Victorian health records was that all of that was a complete lie. She'd never had an MRI. She had no lump on her elbow. There was no cancer diagnosis. There was none of it was true.
Yeah, so Erin actually acknowledged in court that she did mislead them about the cancer. She claimed she was actually too embarrassed to tell them what she claimed was the truth, that she was getting weight loss surgery, a gastric bypass. But that also seemed a little bit dubious, didn't it, Greg?
Well, it did seem dubious because it was quite a big moment in the court, because this came as news to the prosecution, that she hadn't, in the 2 years before the trial, Erin had never mentioned this, but suddenly she claimed she'd been having issues with her weight and had been bulimic for, several years, 20 years, and had finally reached a crisis point and had to do something about it. And the real reason for saying she had cancer was to mask the fact that she was going to be spending some time in hospital for gastric bypass surgery. Unfortunately, when she also said she'd already made an appointment to discuss this at the Enrich Clinic, what she didn't realise, and what the prosecution found out over the weekend, was that the Enrich Clinic did not offer gastric bypass surgery. So then she had to backtrack again and say, well, I thought they did, or I'm not quite sure what. And it was her barrister who suggested that she was really going in for liposuction, which is a very different procedure and not something that I've heard many people who suffer terribly from bulimia would consider. But again, that was Erin having to try to present to the jury some reason why this all happened.
Yeah, so at first she made it seem like she had cancer and wanted to talk to them about that. Then she's saying it was weight loss surgery when she was in court. That turned out probably not to be true. I mean, pretty crazy for that to all play out in court. Another bit that stood out for me from the book and the trial was something that happened on Sunday, which was the day after the lunch.
Yeah.
So at the time, Erin knew that Don and Gail were already in hospital with severe gastroenteritis, and Erin herself claimed that she had been suffering from nausea and diarrhea. Clearly, Clearly, it was something due to what they ate at the lunch. It doesn't take a genius to put that together. And yet, the very next night, when her kids were hungry, her two children, she happily served them some of the leftover beef Wellington in the fridge, albeit after scraping off the mushrooms and the pastry. I mean, tell us why that was such an odd move and what it suggested, Greg.
Well, it goes, I think, to instinctive human behaviour. I mean, any time that, people eat a meal, have a lunch, and then within hours are suffering gastro, they look back at that lunch, and if there's leftovers in the fridge, the first thing you do is just chuck it out. That's, I think, just an instinctive human reaction. So she knew, innocent Erin, if we're believing Erin at this point in time, she knew she'd been suffering from diarrhoea. She knew that at least two of her other guests, Simon claimed he'd also told her about Ian and Heather. So she either knew that all two or all four of them and herself were ill because of the lunch that she'd cooked on that Saturday. And it was very difficult, and you could sort of feel that the jury were finding this impossible to believe, that an innocent Erin, knowing that that lunch had created that many health issues, without a second thought, would serve it to her children. And so the only reasonable explanation for that behaviour is that she knew that the meals that she was serving her children would not make them sick. That was the only reasonable explanation for that.
One of the most shocking parts of the trial and the book occurred on Monday morning, 2 days after the lunch. So at this stage, the four guests were seriously ill in hospital. Not Erin, though. She claimed she was just suffering from some diarrhea, even though she'd eaten the exact same meal as the others, in theory. So Erin decided to go to the hospital to get some fluids to help with her gastro. And once the hospital staff realised who she was, Erin was told by the doctor there was a very grave concern that the lunch she'd served had contained death cap mushrooms, and they told her she needed emergency IV treatment so that she didn't end up as sick as the others. What happened next, Greg? Because this blew my mind.
Well, what happened was she was told that really it was a life and death situation, that this wasn't just, to avoid being some ill health. Dr. Chris Webster was telling her that they did heavily suspect death cap mushrooms. They needed to test her liver function right now in order to save her life if she was suffering from the same illness. Now, most people, when they're told it's life and death, would just immediately allow themselves to be taken into hospital and get immediate treatment. But Erin decided not to. She decided she'd go home. She had to lock up her lambs, feed her dog, find some ballet clothes for her daughter, and get things organised before she came back to hospital. She'd also been told, get your kids here right now too, because if you fed them that meal on the Sunday night, which she'd already said she had, then they needed to be tested right now too, to avoid, again, a life and death situation. She didn't call the school. She made no move to get her kids back to the hospital. Nothing. So all she did was go home.
Which is just mind-boggling, isn't it?
Yeah. So you wonder, what is the reasonable explanation for that behaviour? And this is what the jury were wrestling with. Like, to reach their verdict, they had to decide that actually guilt was the only reasonable explanation for that behaviour, not innocence.
Yeah, she did eventually return to the hospital. In fact, the police were out looking for her so they could bring her into hospital and treat her. It turned out she wasn't that sick after all. She eventually left the hospital after being treated with some fluids. I want to talk now about a food hydrator that Erin owned. Yeah. This was a big part of the trial. We know that Erin had foraged for wild mushrooms in the past. She told her friends that. The prosecution argued that Erin foraged for the death cap mushrooms, dried them using her hydrator, and later deliberately used them in the beef Wellington to kill her guests.
Yeah.
All along, though, Erin had claimed that the only mushrooms she'd used in the dish were from Woolies and some mysterious Asian grocer that she could never provide many details about. Then on August 2, 4 days after the lunch, Erin grabbed her food hydrator and dumped it at the local tip. I mean, pretty sus. She was caught on camera doing this, and she used her bank card to pay for it. Eventually, after the police became suspicious of Erin, they went out and they found that food hydrator that she dumped at the tip. And they asked her about it when they interviewed her at the station. Tell us what happened.
Well, they interviewed her because they had found the manual for a food dehydrator in her kitchen when they did the search. So they were just following normal police procedure and asking her, well, did she have that dehydrator that she had the manual for? And she was saying, no, that was years in the past, and she hadn't used it for several years. She certainly hadn't used it recently. She didn't have a dehydrator at all. What she did not know when she was actually telling these answers, and when you watch that interview online, you have to remember that the police had already recovered that dehydrator from the tip, and it was in the room next door. So the police were asking her questions about a dehydrator that they knew she'd owned because they'd seen her throw it out and they'd already got it and it was in the police station. And yet you watch Erin, and without it blinking, she's just completely denying its existence at all.
And you say in the book, at that stage, that's when the police knew that they were talking to a liar, essentially.
Yeah. And a very good liar, because when you watch that interview, which you can find online, as I said, there's no sense of panic, there's no sense of stress. She's just talking quite normally, denying its complete existence.
So just to cover off all that stuff, we know that she lied to her guests about why she wanted them to come to this lunch in the first place. We know that she then served leftovers to her kids, even though she knew that had potentially poisoned her other guests. She left the hospital once she rocked up there after being told that she was in a potentially life-threatening situation. And then she lies about this food hydrator, even though the cops know that she has it. I mean, there's so much shocking evidence that is obvious why the jury convicted her. But I would like to ask you, Greg, what do you think was the single most damning piece of evidence as to why the jury found this mum of two guilty?
Look, for me, and prefacing everything by saying that the jury were told constantly you have to consider the whole of the evidence in these sort of trials. But for me, it goes back to feeding the kids the leftovers on that Sunday night. For me, there's a sequence of actions that Erin took where it's highly unlikely if she was innocent she would have taken them. For me, the thing with the feeding the kids the beef Wellingtons, regardless of whether the mushrooms are scraped off or not, doing that, there's no other explanation, I feel, for doing that than that she knew that those beef Wellingtons did not contain death cap mushrooms. You wouldn't, even if you knew that they were death cap mushrooms, you wouldn't just scrape it off because she would have known it only took, 8 millionth of a kilogram to kill people. So a mother and a woman who does that, for me, will only do it if she's guilty of knowing exactly which Wellingtons were poisoned and which weren't. And I think that's the one piece of evidence that you cannot find a reason why an innocent Erin would have done that.
I should add again that Erin is appealing her sentence, but to everyone who is not across the details of this trial, go and get Greg's book, The Mushroom Murders. There are so many other shocking pieces of evidence, including that Ian, the survivor, claims that Erin had used a different coloured plate from her guests. Those plates were never found. There was also the fact that Erin had multiple mobile phones that she wiped, possibly to try and conceal her tracks. The book is mind-blowing, Greg. Thank you so much for writing it, and thanks for chatting to news.com.au.
Thanks, Bucky. It's been a pleasure.
Follow or subscribe to From the Newsroom wherever you get your podcasts.